Right.
Okay, so let's start. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much, Charles Courtmanche, for being here to present today. It's a pleasure to have you. Chuck is professor at the University of Kentucky and director of the Institute for the Study of Free Enterprise. And today he will be talking about vaping taxes and obesity. So the floor is yours, Chuck. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you all for inviting me. Really appreciate the opportunity, and good to see everyone. So this is I can't take credit for the witty title there. That's I'll credit / blame my co-author Joe Savia, who some of you know. So this paper is about the effect of e-cigarette taxes on obesity, and it's with several collaborators from a place where the weather is probably a lot better than where I am right now from San Diego. So this builds into a very long interdisciplinary literature just about the relationship between nicotine and body weight. So large literature going way back, mostly associational, just kind of tracking people after they quit smoking, or just associations between smoking status and body weight, finds that that quitting smoking tends to be associated with a weight gain. And there's this meta-analysis down here that's about a weight gain of 9 pounds on average. Biologically, there are some reasons for that. Nicotine is known to be an appetite suppressant and also a metabolic stimulant. So if you're talking about the calories in, calories out, nicotine potentially affects both sides of that equation. So then the connection. So then the question is that causal. And just one piece of evidence suggesting it is a study co-authors and I had where we leveraged it was a randomized smoking cessation program. So you're randomized into the program, which had a very high success rate of lasting smoking cessation, and kind of an IV type of framework, finding about an 11 to 12 pound weight gain, right? So if anything, suggesting the associational estimates might be a touch under, but they're in the same ballpark. So you can envision, you quit smoking in the ballpark of a 10-pound weight gain. Of course, that's going to be more or less depending on height and size and so on. But and some people will gain nothing, and some will gain quite a lot. So there's certainly heterogeneity there, but that's kind of that modest to moderate type of weight gain. So where this got interesting, and where I was saying offline before everyone joined, this paper for me is full circle. This goes all the way, my job market paper back now 17 years ago, which is a little frightening, but it was on the effect of cigarette taxes on body weight. So, same kind of motivation, right? But now here we are later with a product that barely existed back then, and kind of doing the same thing again. So it's this kind of full circle for me. But the reason I got into this, as well as many others, a couple decades ago, this question about the smoking and weight connection is, number one, there was this associational evidence, really mostly in public health, suggesting a connection. Number two, the trends between, if I was fancier, I'd have this on a slide, but it's this, right? These were the trends in smoking and obesity over a few decades. Kind of leading up to that, smoking rates had gone down substantially. Obesity rates in parallel had gone up substantially. So raising the question about, is there some causality there, right? And then the third thing being that this really becomes an economics question, in part because because policy had been so aggressive towards smoking, right? And cigarette taxes in particular is kind of a clear example. So you got cigarette taxes in there as an exogenous sort of determinant of smoking, potentially exogenous, and that kind of brings the economists on board. So those of us who were studying this issue a few decades ago, I mean, it was kind of, is this association causal that had been documented so often? And at the time, thinking of the cost of cigarettes as being, kind of a natural instrument for smoking to kind of break that endogeneity. And that kind of sent us all in an interesting direction that I'll get to. But basically, that's the motivation. We all know I kind of skipped over these stats about obesity because I think we all more or less know that. Um, I'm sorry, I just presented this in Canada. I forgot to drop that first bullet point there. That was for my Canadian audience. But if anyone here is, then there you go. But yeah, so this is the overall question, right? Is nicotine associated with weight? Is it causal? And then if it is, then the policies that would be used, which would make this kind of well within the realm of economics, that be used to drive down smoking could have this unintended consequence. So as economists often are, is kind of hunting for potential unintended consequences, and if the unintended consequence was big enough, theoretically you could reverse the decline, right? Or you could kind of reverse the intended public health impacts. But here was the key of this sort of first wave back when it was just looking at cigarettes, is this line here. Um, all of these studies would sort of end with the same disclaimer somewhere, in the conclusion, which is, okay, so even though we found that quitting smoking leads to weight gain, the health benefit from quitting smoking is going to be so much more than the health cost of the weight you might gain that this does not mean don't quit smoking because you're afraid of some weight gain, right? So the kind of net effect was clear. um, and so that takes us to e-cigarettes, which here many years later become, to me anyway, and to my co-authors, interesting in this particular topic because there's the potential, and I'm not potential, theoretically, to reverse this kind of bottom line conclusion down here. What I mean by that is general consensus, and again, I'm being careful here because this is not settled, right? General consensus being that e-cigarettes are not unharmful, but they're not as harmful as cigarettes, fewer chemicals, not combustible, etc. Putting up a little bit of a range here from a few studies. Point being, the point of putting this 5 to 37% range on there is not to nail down a specific number. It's to do the opposite, really. It's to emphasize that while there appears to be a consensus that all else equal, vaping, if you got to use something, vaping would be preferable. Um, there's a wide disagreement over exactly how much, right? If vaping is half as harmful as smoking versus 5% as harmful as smoking, that's a big difference as far as potential policy implications, right? So that's sort of a battle being forged in maybe other disciplines mostly, but for here we're sort of taking as an assumption that it's at least somewhat healthier, and we don't know exactly how much. Okay, so that's the interesting pitch, is just if you, and again, the results I'm going to find are maybe not going to say opposite. But just theoretically, hypothetically, it would not be hard to calibrate some realistic numbers that would argue that, let's suppose vaping is truly 5% as harmful as smoking. Well, if you're able to successfully quit vaping and go to no nicotine, but let's say you gain 10 pounds, because presumably that effect should be similar. Um, now 5% the harms, the benefit of stopping smoking is going to be much bigger than the cost of gaining 10 pounds. But if vaping is only 5% as harmful, is 0.05 times the benefit of quitting smoking still bigger than the cost of gaining 10 pounds? That is no longer clear, right? I mean, you could easily calibrate numbers where that's going to be a no, right? So the interesting thing in getting into this topic, and again, as I've said, I'm not actually going to find that, but that was kind of the why this was interesting, and for me and for us who had been into the smoking weight literature is sort of a natural place to go with it, because we it was possible going in that we might find something that would imply that e-cigarette taxation could actually be a negative for public health. And that's only talking about we haven't even started talking about substitutability yet with cigarettes, right? But that'll be in there as well. So that's really that's really kind of the motivation and the setup here. Like, is it possible that cracking down on vaping could have these unintended consequences that would diminish some of the effectiveness for public health and maybe even overturn it and turn the sign around, right? So that's the setup and the motivation. And David, that's probably a good place to check in with you if there's questions.
Yeah, no questions so far.
No questions yet. All right. And feel free to interrupt if there are.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so let me now turning to e-cigarette taxes. As you can see here, e-cigarettes are a relatively recent phenomenon. You go from having no taxes in 2010 to the majority of the country having some sort of e-cigarette tax and some passing multiple over a relatively short time frame. And currently, just to give you an idea of the range, currently the highest tax is Minnesota. And, you know, it's a little bit hard. Something to keep in mind as you see results and so on is it's pretty easy to conceptualize the tax on a pack of cigarettes, right? A little bit harder to conceptualize the vaping tax because kind of what are those units and how can we make that apples to apples? So the approach we're going to use, which follows some prior studies and process that have been developed there, is we're going to talk about e-cigarette taxes in the form of dollars per milliliter of e-liquid. Okay. And so then again, you're going to want to think in terms of, well, how's that compare to cigarette? Generally, roughly speaking, on average, a milliliter of e-liquid is going to come out to about a third to a half a pack of cigarettes. Okay. So to make equivalent to a pack of cigarettes, you would want to multiply that by 2 to 3, right? So, so this would be a very high, if you multiply it by 2 to 3, you know, talk $6 plus, right? That would be on the high side as far as cigarette taxes. So the Minnesota tax is large. There's others that are quite large, and then there's some that are quite small, right? Okay. So now, you know, on the other, now I'll pull in this idea of substitution, right? So there's several studies, and I've been a co-author on some of them, that show that ENDS taxes reduce ENDS use among youths and among adults, right? There's you know, Nielsen data studies, there's survey based, there's lots of different ways that's been done. And generally speaking, not aware of too many exceptions, actually. I mean, it's close to consensus that there is some, quote, first stage, that ENDS taxes do at least something to reduce ENDS use among youths. You know, we had one study of the pass-through rate of about 1 and then an elasticity of roughly 1, give or take as well. So what we know about elasticity of ENDS suggests that it's higher than the elasticity of cigarettes, which is, you know, generally in the 0.3 or under kind of range. So anyway, so I'm kind of pivoting here to the literature on ENDS taxes. And first thing, ENDS taxes do seem to reduce ENDS use, whether that be among youths, adults, etc. Now, there's also a good bit of evidence, though, that they lead to substitution towards cigarettes. You know, and then this evidence isn't quite as universal, but it's still, I'd say, a strong majority. And so again, you're getting into these unintended consequences, right? So ENDS taxes, on one hand, they're going to drive down vaping, but if they increase smoking as well, then, you know, again, if we're talking a health factor of a ratio of health harms of 0.05, right? Then probably, you know, let's hypothetically just say every 2 people that quit smoking, 1 goes to vaping, and I'm sorry, every 2 people that quit vaping, 1 goes to smoking and 1 stops totally, right? Well, then if the ratio of health harms is half, you kind of cut that even. If it's 0.05, I mean, not hard, right, again, to come up with numbers where e-cigarette taxation would actually hurt public health on that. And then you throw it in. So what we're kind of adding into that is we're kind of piling on with one more possible unintended consequence if there's a meaningful effect on obesity. So that's kind of, yeah, again, the idea, trying to move kind of from this, well, how does ENDS taxes reduce ENDS use? I'm sorry, ENDS, I don't think I said ENDS, acronym for electronic nicotine delivery system, basically synonymous with e-cigarettes. That's just kind of the term we tend to use in the paper. So again, this is all I think interesting, and you know, what economists tend to bring to the table on these conversations is an understanding that you need to frame this versus the counterfactual, as opposed to versus maybe the ideal of no use, right? And so it's all about the counterfactual, right? And that's kind of what these sort of studies, obviously using these methods, are trying to drive at. So you know, and what's interesting with that, especially, is the one line policy narrative, right, about e-cigarettes is generally something like this: that, well, on the one hand, we don't want teens to have another pathway into nicotine addiction. On the other hand, we want, you know, long-term smokers to be able to have an option to switch to something that feels similar but is actually less harmful. So the harm reduction idea, right? So it's so that's kind of where we're, you know, where the counterfactual comes in, is it's not even actually obvious that, and again, I'm not implying the reverse is automatically true, but this idea that, you know, teens are better off if e-cigarette taxes are so high that they can't access them is actually itself oversimplistic, because we want to know the counterfactual, right? If a teen who otherwise would have vaped, now because vaping taxes are so high, now can we assume they're just not going to use nicotine? I mean, these studies collectively would say, no, we can't assume that a portion of those people would have just smoked cigarettes, or, you know, little cigars or whatever, something more harmful, right? So it's actually not even totally obvious that e-cigarette taxes improve the health even of teens if we kind of frame it out of that counterfactual, right? I mean, I have 5 kids. I mean, you know, if I had my pick, I would like none of them to start using nicotine, right? Um, but you know, if the other option was that they'd become like lifelong cigarette smokers, then you would sort of prefer like anything else to that, right? So that's kind of that idea. So a little bit controversial, but I mean, as economists, we can understand the math of how that's at least plausible, right? So what we're going to be doing in this study, the contribution here is pretty easy to say compared to some others where you got to split hairs a little more. We're not aware of any other study looking at the effect of ENDS taxes on body weight. We think we're the first there. Of course, you never know, right? But if you're missing something, but certainly there hasn't been much work on that area. And again, I kind of let off with this, but this is in the spirit of that older literature on the effect of e-cigarette taxes on weight. Okay. So any questions so far?
No,
Good.
no.
All right. So now I need to kind of, having set up that motivation, going to need to say just a little bit about this earlier literature that some of you are, I think, familiar with, on the effect of e-cigarette taxes on weight. And again, this goes back a ways in terms of econometric methods and understandings of things. But you know, we go back to 2004, when I was a second-year grad student, and I like to say that when I first started studying obesity, there were like 5 papers that I knew about, and since then the obesity literature became quite obese. You know, over time, it really took off. But this is kind of back in the early days still. This literature on the effect of e-cigarette taxes on weight. Again, the initial sort of way of thinking about it is that e-cigarette taxes or prices, sometimes they use prices, sometimes both, that the causal chain would be cost of cigarettes go up, smoking goes down, then that drives weight up, right? Thinking very much, thinking, conceptualizing it as an IV model, right? Now, a lot of times this was done reduced form. It might not be being actually done IV, but the way the results were discussed and framed was with that understanding. So implicitly, what you're assuming there, the exclusion restriction, right? In 2004, that wasn't sort of super clearly understood, but that even if a policy or whatever the instrument is exogenous, conceptually, you have to assume it only affects weight through smoking, right? So that's the exclusion restriction here. And, kind of started off maybe taken for granted a little bit and then kind of evolved. But here was where that literature in like a minute, landed and why that's important for this study. Basically, the literature, got big there, but because there was disagreement. Chow et al., a study that included Mike Grossman, for instance, found, large positive, large cigarette taxes led to more obesity, which is the expected direction, right? Because cigarette taxes up, smoking down, obesity up. Gruber and Frakes made some methodological tweaks that would sound sensible, on their face, right? But it flipped the result and actually got it, quote, wrong side. And so they sort of framed that as a bit of a puzzle. Baum had an approach using people with a history of tobacco use as like control group, kind of this third difference, this triple difference type approach. And they found that flipped things back to a positive. Okay. And then my first study, my job market paper, in a sentence, what it showed was that you could take all three of these methodologies, and if you let the effect trace out over, a 5 or 6 year period, that you would flip the sign back to negative now, back to counterintuitive. Okay, so there was this sort of methodological, debate going on. And I don't know if any of you guys have done this, but I found myself arguing with myself in this literature a fair bit. Not sure if anyone's listening, but you argue with yourself and in public, right? But that's science, right? It's you learn and you change your theories as you learn more, and that's how, nothing wrong with that. But anyway, my '09 study, of course, I try to come up with some plausible explanation, right? When it looks pretty methodologically rigorous and it's all coming out, quote, wrong side. And the thought I had was at the time was, well, maybe once you successfully quit smoking, maybe you gain a little weight in the short run, but then maybe that, all of a sudden you get more enthusiastic about health. You get more confident in your ability to take on other health behaviors, right? Now that you've had a win. And so maybe in the long run, you develop these healthier habits in other areas that sort of overpower the direct biological effect. Sounded plausible at the time. Problem is, my own study here almost a decade later with co-authors, the randomized one, we had the data to trace that out for 6 years, and it didn't, right? It stayed, the increase stayed. So yeah, I mean, unless it's a different local average treatment effect, different population, which is possible, that would sort of refute my original hypothesis there. In that 18 study, we proposed kind of a different possible explanation. So we kind of wrestled a little at the end with this question of, okay, if our study using this randomized variation, and probably the most credible design thus far, if that study is pretty solid on quitting smoking does in fact lead to weight gain, can you reconcile that with higher cigarette taxes leading to weight loss? Is it possible that both of those things are true at the same time? On the face, they sound contradictory, right? But that's why we're back to the exclusion restriction. Is it possible that cigarette taxes affect weight in ways other than through smoking behavior? And, one of the explanations we sort of threw out there in that 18 paper is the income, not even income effect, right? When cigarette taxes go up, historically, yes, some people quit smoking, but a whole lot more smokers don't quit, right? So if you have you might, for instance, have let's say in the data, like a 30% smoking rate, and you might get that down by 3 percentage points. So, what's the other 27% of the population doing who is continuing to smoke even as the tax went up, right? Um, well, they're just poorer, okay? And then what's that going to do? You the causal effect of income on health outcomes and health behavior is subject of debate. My read on that literature is, the association between income and health behaviors is sort of obvious, but studies that have actually tried to get at causality there, it looks like the late matter, like there's different lates, different subpopulations, heterogeneous effects. There's not really a punchline there. But theoretically, you could envision cigarette taxes go up. People are basically just poorer, or the majority of smokers continue to smoke, and they're just poorer. And then what does it crowd out? If you're spending another $50 or something on cigarettes, what does that crowd out? Well, one of the places where there does seem to be a pretty clear income effect is on restaurant eating, right? So just to throw out one plausible possibility, now you go to restaurants less, maybe a couple times less a month, and it wouldn't take much more than that to explain the size of the weight loss that we found. So could there be an income effect? Could there also be something like, well, if cigarette taxes go up, that increases revenue, right? And what's being done with that revenue? Is that revenue going, say, to fund Medicaid? Is it going to fund a educational program to help drive down smoking? So there's basically the point I'm making here is that it is, I think, incorrect to frame in your head that there's this like implicit IV where it's the effect of cigarette taxes on weight is operating just via its effect on smoking, right? That there could be other factors involved that could actually flip that reduced form sign. And of course, the exact same logic would apply to e-cigarettes, right? And that's kind of where we're going from. So all that is to say that your first reaction would be any source of nicotine that goes down, weight's going to go up because of these direct biological mechanisms. A more kind of rigorous way of thinking about it, you realize that's not, it's really more ambiguous. Any questions at this point?
No, not so far, but
Okay.
following very carefully, very interesting.
All right. I'm either explaining it great or terrible then, one or the other, right? So yeah, so anyway, what we're going to find is actually going to end up being results that are super similar looking to those that I found in that '09 study all those years ago, right? That ends taxes are going to end up, if anything, leading to a small reduction in weight. And so that's why I went to all the trouble of tying all that together, because kind of remarkably, you tend to see a similar pattern. Yeah.
Sorry, Chuck, there is a question by Joan Costa Font that says, I wonder whether you have considered signaling effect of taxes, suggesting that e-cigarettes are risky, so there might be behavioral effects.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about possible channels passing through the signal.
Yes. Yes, we some of these same co-authors and I looked at that in a different study where it was just looking at teen ends use and cigarette smoking. And we looked at directly in there the effect of e-cigarette taxes on perception of harms. And that absolutely showed up, that e-cigarette taxes did influence the perception of harms among teens, which makes sense. Yeah, so I'd buy that signaling effect for sure, especially when you're in an unknown, right? Teens are going to hear so much kind of conflicting information, and so something like that as a signal when kind of the truth is maybe unknown, Absolutely, I believe that. Now, harder for me to think through how that would be showing up and mattering here in this particular study, I guess. So that would be a mechanism. I think the clearest way to think of that is that would be a mechanism through which ENDS taxes would drive down vaping, right? So it would strengthen that quote implicit first stage. I'd have to think harder about how that would connect to obesity and what that would entail. But you know, a fair comment, and I've jotted it down here to investigate more. So thank you. Yeah, so we're going to basically find this modest reduction. That's going to be the headline. We are going to be primarily focused on teens, whereas that earlier literature was primarily focused on adults. Reason just simply being that teens vape a lot more. There's more statistical power, you know, involved, and you'll see when we look at adults, there's not much there in either direction on weight, and the primary reason for that seems to be there's not much there in terms of an effect on vaping in this particular sample and time period either. And why is that? Because vaping rates were so low to start with in that population. So we're primarily going to be looking at teens. We'll touch on adults. And so we find ENDS taxes lead to modest reductions in weight, if anything. And that particularly shows up with female teens. And then we're going to spend some time talking about the why, right? Can we come up with something resembling a compelling explanation? And there's two things to be aware of when you think of the why. One is that, and this is a new thing, like this was not relevant in the old cigarette literature. Number one, you could, to the extent that there's substitution towards cigarettes, that is going to blunt the reduction in nicotine intake, which in turn is going to blunt anything that's downstream from that reduction in nicotine intake, right? So if 1 every 2 people who don't vape because of these taxes are smoking instead, then the effect on nicotine, you know, apples to apples, is half of what it could be. So that right there would seem to push things toward a null, right, in the direction of a null. But that alone wouldn't get you to sort of the wrong sign, the quote wrong sign. So you kind of have to look at other health behaviors. How are ENDS taxes influencing other health behaviors? To try to unpack that puzzle a little bit. And, you know, we basically do what we can do with the variables available in the data sets that we have, although this mechanism analysis is admittedly a little more preliminary. But we do find some evidence that ENDS taxes reduce alcohol use, reduce marijuana use, and lead to, along some dimensions, healthier eating habits. And so that would be all consistent with this broader behavioral change happening, which could be an income effect, could be something else that's harder to kind of parse out. Yeah, so I'm going for this, with this being an hour, not hour and a half, I'm going to skip over this section, but if you're interested, the paper has I don't dare call it a theoretical model because people like David would get grumpy with me if I did, but because it's definitely not a real theoretical model, but just sketching out some equations just to put some structure around the ideas I've been saying. So this is just a long way of saying that that the net effect of vaping taxes on weight is in fact theoretically ambiguous. And so we worked through some equations to get there. This is really the punchline, and you can just look at the text down here. That the quote direct, what I'm calling the direct effect, the more biological effect. You stop vaping, your appetite goes up, your metabolism goes down. These are the red, and those, of course, both point toward weight gain, right? But then you've got these income effects that put a question mark, could go either way. And then you've also got these effects on cigarette smoking, these cross effects, which would cut the other way, right? Would push it toward zero. And then you've got these potential complementary effects on other health behaviors. Just if nicotine and alcohol and marijuana are inherently substitutes or complements, and there's some evidence to suggest complementarity between e-cigarettes and both alcohol and marijuana. So basically it's, you know, the first look, it looks like it's an unambiguous positive. You put it all together, it's not really as unambiguous. All right, so just dig into the data and touch on some key results. We're basically using the state and national YRBS as our main data source for youth. Noteworthy things here would just be that we are, in our main analyses, dumping the state and national together to make one big sample, which is often done. Then you've got to do something with the weights to make it all representative, and we follow kind of some convention in the literature there. Maybe more pressing is these, so to be aware of one of the big limitations of these kind of studies is there's just not, vaping data hasn't been collected for that long. And so when you're talking about things like having a good long pre-trend in an event study, there's just only so much you can do a little bit. So our vaping regressions are going to use 15 to 23 because that's where the data are, and it's every other year. But on the positive side, for all these other outcomes, body weight and height, smoking, alcohol use, etc., we can go all the way back to 2011. So we got a little longer time frame to work with there. And that's a period that spans the implementation of basically all ENDS taxes. There are some changes in the survey prior to that make it make sense to start in 11. So just briefly, and again, I'm aware that I've never been very good at hour-long talks, so I'll move this along quicker. But ENDS use, this is among that sample of teens, high school age, right? Current ENDS use, which could just be one time in the last 30 days, 20%. So that's kind of the stat that causes the alarm, right? That makes it sound like epidemic. But if you look at more habitual use, only 6% are what we call frequent users, 20 of the past 30 days or more, and every day is just 4%. So, if you think about that as the potential population that could be affected, you kind of see that they're going to be pushed for power a little bit, right? Because those aren't huge means to start with. And it's the other outcomes. You see there's a lot of outcomes. So we address this issue of social desirability and recall bias in these survey-based measures, which is always something to be aware of. The one thing I can say there is there is some work in the obesity literature kind of using NHANES where you have both both actual and self-reported heights and weights to kind of do a correction. For the self-reports, Collietta did a correction. We co-authors and I also did one. And implementing those corrections, which is for adults, doesn't seem to do a whole lot, affects the point estimates a little bit, but doesn't really like overturn signs or anything like that. So we acknowledge that there's going to be measurement error here, that obesity rates that are self-reported are going to be lower than actual, but they're not super low, right? I mean, even self-reported, we're at a 15% childhood obesity rate. So there's enough there to work with, and we argue that the nature of the error is sort of close enough to random that it's not going to be too much of a problem here. But we'll just acknowledge that as a caveat. The data on ENDS taxes, Chad Cotty and co-authors, we're using their standardized measure. So basically, there's different types of ENDS taxes, excise, ad valorem, and this standardizes them all, makes them apples to apples. Another kind of data point, we have state level identifiers. Most taxation is state level. Not all of it. Some is local, some is city or county. So the way we handle that is, if there's 10 million people in your state and 1 million of them live in a jurisdiction with an additional $1 tax, then we're just adding that in as a share, as a 0.1, right? So we're adding 10% of the population faces another $1 tax, so we'll add in a 0.1, population weighted. So it's essentially the tax rate, the average tax rate faced by residents in that state. And so the sample means, so as you interpret results, we want to kind of focus on. So the sample mean tax is, this suggests that $1, which is our unit, right, is very big. It's like 3 times the sample mean. At the same time, there are 6 states with over a $2 tax. So looking at $1 increments is still way within scope, way within range. So it's a very reasonable, you know, unit to use in terms of what an actual tax might look like. All right, and so here, as you can see, the rolling out, and we're, you know, Minnesota was out early, but you can see by the end there's a good bit of variation. Let me stop for questions there. Anything?
Yeah, I do have one question. How
Yeah.
much does it correspond in terms of income? How much is income reduced by these taxes? If you have an idea over the average monthly income.
Great question. And that's something I honestly need a straight answer to. Let me write that down. There's a paper by Mike Pesco and a co-author recently looking at income effects on the income effects from cigarette taxes. So I might refer people to that for a little closer look at that issue. And you know, my reading of that paper is sort of, on one hand, their number didn't sound like it was huge, but then they were able to find effects of cigarette taxes on consumption of lots of different goods, including foods. So there was enough there to drive downstream effects, even if it didn't sound that big. So I don't think I know a number specifically enough to give you one. I don't want to just take a shot in the dark, but I definitely need to, that's something I need to know. So thanks for pointing that out. The one point I will make, I personally think the income effect idea is more plausible for teens than for adults. And the reason being that, you know, your household might make 100,000. Well, how much does you know, your typical 15-year-old living in that household actually have access to, right? I mean,
Sure.
you know, they might have, you know, a 20 in their pocket that a parent gave them, right? And then that's kind of their money for the week. And if they're kind of under the table buying some e-cigs from someone at school, then, and that's taking, you know, now that's taking $15 and not 10. That's right. So as a share of the actual disposable income a teenager has, I think it can be substantial. As a share of the household income of someone making 6 figures, not so much, right? So I do think that's an important thing to think about. And to me anyway, as a parent of a teenager and having been one before, it seems plausible that if you're spending an extra $5 a week on vapes, what does that mean? Well, now maybe that's one less time I go to McDonald's with my friends. Maybe
Sure.
that's, I go to the movies and I don't buy food there instead of buying food there, right? Those seem like some of the natural margins for substitution. That's not scientific. It's just a gut feeling, but
No, I agree. I would go for that.
yeah. And I think you can see some results that square with that. But all right, so yeah, so we've got the usual control variables. You know, I'm not going to, with the time, go in too much to all these other policies, but basically we've got the kitchen sink of other plausibly relevant policies, and we build up the model, right, so that we look at robustness across their inclusion or exclusion. For adults, behavioral risk factor surveillance system, so kind of the sister, you know, data set to the YRBS, has the nice advantage of being enormous. And, you know, similar types of questions. It's annual, so we've got 8 years here of ENDS-use data. All right, and then the outcomes, and this is why, again, like I said, this is why this paper puts a little less emphasis on adults. This current ENDS-use number was 0.2 for kids, right, for teens. These numbers are just lower, and so that means a smaller plausible effect on vaping and a much smaller plausible effect on downstream outcomes. You know, so basically we don't necessarily expect a whole lot here in this adult sample, and we didn't get a lot, but we'll show you those results anyway. All right. The econometric approach is nothing surprising. It's your usual two-way fixed effects, where you've got the outcome, whether it's ends use or obesity or the different possible mechanisms being regressed on ends tax rate, and then your covariates and your fixed effects for time and for location. So just to show, we kind of have these three sets of results. The main, YRBS results for teens. So to show the results for teens for the quote main outcomes, vaping itself, and then weight, and then parallel results for adults. And then in the end, there's mechanisms and for teens and adults. All right, so for sake of time, I am going to just focus on follow the red box. Okay, that'll be how I'll discuss these results. And then if you want, you can see, robustness or lack thereof over there. But here, first showing you the effect of a $1 increase in ends taxes on youth vaping. And here focusing first on any current. So that's the one with the 0.2 mean. And after adding all the controls, and there can be some debate about whether that's unambiguously a good thing to do, but for being on the conservative side and saying conditional on the kitchen sink, what we find here is that a $1 increase, kind of a standard looking vaping tax, reduces vaping by 1.3 percentage points on a base of 0.2. And that's not super different than what the literature tends to find. A lot of estimates in the 1 to 2 percentage point ballpark. Now, I want to emphasize we're also going to show throughout results from this 3-year moving average tax effect. Okay, what the reason for that? So that's literally just current year tax, previous 3 years, just a simple average. Why? To parallel the old cigarette tax literature where dynamics mattered, lagged effects mattered, just to give that a way to show up. Trickier here because we don't have nearly the power to play with. So like if you try to put them in separately, right, contemporaneous and 3 lags, things just get all over the place and it's just hard to make much of. So smoothing it over in this way, we felt like was the best way to get at possible dynamics. But as you can see, that's not doing a whole lot. The estimates are, if anything, a little smaller than the contemporaneous. So that's kind of this first. And again, don't call it a first stage, right? This is the effect on one of the possible mechanisms, but there could be others too. Now, this is looking at the other vaping measures, the more habitual ones. Okay. Here we're looking at the effect on everyday use. I kind of skipped over frequent because it looks a lot like everyday. But what's interesting, this effect was 0.013. This one is 0.014. It's actually a tick bigger. And this one also a tick bigger. And that's on a base of less than 0.04. Right? So these are quite a bit bigger effects when framed as like a percent, right? So these would be viewed as fairly substantial effects on habitual vaping, I think. And again, in line with prior literature. Okay. And then frequent I had out of order, sorry, but same idea.
Chuck, I have a couple of questions before you
Yes, go for it.
proceed. So one is from Anna Barza from a couple of slides ago. Are there differences in the probability of vaping across the BMI distribution? And the second one by Chris Froome is, I'm assuming the state and year fixed effects are controlled for. Is that correct or
Yes,
not?
yes, it
Why
is.
not? Okay.
Yes. Great question on the effects across the BMI distribution. That is not something we have looked at. So I'll mark that down on the to-do list. So yeah, great question.
And the third one, John Costafont, that asks, did you consider smoking bans which differ across states?
So those are in, a couple questions about the controls, and I went through that pretty quickly. So on other e-cigarette policies, we've got all these, which includes the ban on indoor use at the state level. We also have smoking bans at on cigarettes. So we are controlling for those both for cigarettes and e-cigarettes. And that would come on board here in column 4 to 5, okay, is where you would see those come on to the specification.
Thanks.
Good. Okay, so let's go to, so this is gender specific estimates, okay? And what I want to highlight here is bigger effect on females as compared to males. And again, you look in the red. And let's particularly look at habitual, where it was more interesting. 1.5 percentage point effect in both the models for females, the full controls. For males, you know, somewhere between half and 3/4 the size. Okay, so a little bit clearer effect on vaping for females than males. So we'll kind of hold on to that point because we'll see a similar pattern on weight. Here's finally the results for weight. We measure weight a lot of different ways to show robustness. The sort of quote primary measure here is just weight in pounds, and then controlling for height. Obviously BMI, you know, something we look at, percentile BMI, all the things. So this isn't the only way we look at it, but it's kind of the easiest to interpret, right? And these numbers center sort of around 1, right? So this is pooled both genders together. So let's just go straight to the results that split by gender. This again, the outcome is body weight controlling for height. This means about 1 pound to 2 pounds, right? So on average, the impact of a $1 increase in vaping taxes is to reduce teen female body weight by 1 to 2 pounds on a base of 138 pounds, right? So again, I mean, this is as a percent of body weight, this is not that big, right? It's 1 to 2 pounds. You know, it's the same as many obesity studies on obesity. You know, it's hard to move the needle too much. And so a lot of things move the needle a little bit, kind of. So 1 to 2 pounds on average. And again, then you're like, well, is all of that coming from the 1% of let's call it 2% of females who quit vaping? Okay. That means if we're thinking of that like an IV, we got to multiply this by 50, right? So that right there kind of tells you like even though these magnitudes are seem pretty small, they're probably too big to be fully explained by that effect on vaping itself. There feels like there have to be other mechanisms involved, whether it's the income effect or something else. Okay. And for males, we definitely don't see as clear results, much less robust, less significance. Okay, here's those other weight outcomes, which for time I probably should skip over. So here's your kind of event studies. This is for youth ends use, and you can see the pre-trends are sort of serviceable, clear reduction right at the right time. And here is weight, and here we got it stratified into gender, but pre-trends look good. You see that it takes, right, this sort of is sensible. Right away, it's like you start to get a little decrease. It's not significant yet. Now it becomes significant 2 to 3 years later and kind of stays there. So that seems plausible with weight being something that needs some time to adjust. For males, you know, the point estimates look like there's something there, right? But the confidence intervals are just too wide to say that conclusively. And if anything, it seems to shrink a little. Okay, we do the whole pile of expected robustness checks that probably aren't worth your time to go through, but happy to answer questions about any of them. Probably the one that's most notable here is, you know, we're in the land of staggered treatment time, TWFE, right? So you got to do something about that. For now, the one thing we've done is the stacked diff and diff, which you all are probably familiar with, and that, you know, seems to come out okay. Probably ought to consider a couple more of those methods. One thing that's a little tricky there is we are dealing with a continuous treatment, right? And so that's something that kind of restricts options a little bit. All right, so here we're looking at heterogeneity and the effect on teens by race and ethnicity and age, other things. The one thing that pops in this table is that, small reduction in weight for females. It is totally not there for Black and Hispanic female teens, right? So that's totally concentrated among, white and others. Okay, now I have like 5 minutes, so kind of hit these last few results. This is looking at adults. So for adults now, like I said, not expecting much to happen here, and definitely don't find much, so we didn't spend a ton of energy on it. But so current ends use, null results. Everyday ends use, when we use the 3-year moving average specification, we do get a couple stars to pop. But remember, for teens, it was like a 1.4 on a base of 4.1, I think. It was more than a 1/3 increase relative to base. Here, it's more like 1/9, right? So the 0.0028 as a percent of that is a good bit smaller than it was for teens. So, there's not maybe as much scope for an impact to start with, and then even as a percent of that low mean, it's pretty small. So there could be, now there are other studies that do show that ENDS taxes matter for adults. Kind of is what it is. We have looked at young adults as well and don't find a ton there either. You might think maybe under 30 you'd get more. And sometimes you do in these kind of studies. We don't see it as much here. So to adult weight outcomes, with this little happening on vaping, you would maybe be surprised if you saw a lot happening here, right? Even if it's just an income effect, I mean, it's still off at 2% of the population. And we don't find anything statistically significant. The event studies look, serviceable again, but still getting a lot of nulls. So let me spend quickly these last 2 minutes on just the mechanisms, and I can highlight the key points pretty quickly. So remember, the first possible explanation for there not being a big positive effect was that substitution towards cigarette smoking could blunt the impact. These sort of studies generally do find an increase in smoking. We sort of do. When the sample is restricted to the years in which there's vaping data, we do see an impact in line with prior literature. When we use the longer sample period, we don't. It's still positive. Make what you will of that. It's some evidence, right? Now, looking at these other mechanisms, right? So we do see binge drinking is going down. We're back to teens, I should specify. Binge drinking going down, marijuana use going down. There is one prior study that also finds that by Joe Sabi and co-authors. So we're kind of finding results consistent with that. So those are interesting cross effects, suggesting some inherent complementarity, right? Or an income effect. You could get that either way. Not really seeing anything on exercise. These dietary habit variables, the thing to really, the big caveat here is that they're pretty crude. It's like, did you drink soda once this week? Did you eat a vegetable this week? I mean, but 10% of the sample didn't eat a vegetable this week, so that's a little disheartening on its own. But fruits, same thing. So we are not getting the fine-tuned details here of a substitution response. But one thing that pops out that I think is super interesting is this result for vegetables. Okay. I mean, that's pretty robust and clear. So an increase in the probability of eating any vegetables that week. To me, and yes, you could tell other stories, but a story that fits there is the one where, okay, they skipped a trip to McDonald's with their friends, and instead that night they had dinner at home that was made by mom and dad, right? And that dinner made at home is a whole lot more likely to have a vegetable in it, right? So I don't think this is the teen is going out and buying carrots at Kroger. I think it's they're eating more meals with the family. But again, can't show that directly with these data. Okay. Yeah, split by gender. We actually see the stronger vegetable effect on males. Clear marijuana effects on both. And some of these splits with thin, outcomes that are kind of rare. You're asking a lot of the data, but kind of is what it is. For adults, not seeing a whole lot with mechanisms. Well, there wasn't a lot in the first place, right? The one thing is, seeing a slight, very small reduction in alcohol use, and then a little bit on binge drinking, and a little bit on fries, right? So there's something happening there, but again, there wasn't a whole lot of a reduced form effect to explain anyway. So can wrap up there, and sorry I got off to a slow start there and rushed a bit, but just to get the key points, to reiterate the key points, you might fear that ENDS taxes would have this unintended consequence of increasing weight, and then potentially even could offset or undo the potential public health benefits. That is not what our results are consistent with ultimately. We find that that's kind of headline number one, no evidence whatsoever that ENDS taxes lead to weight gain among teens or adults. Like, we just didn't find that in any specification. Then where you split hairs is more, well, was there weight loss or not weight loss? And seems like female teens there probably was. The other group's a little murkier, but the real headline here is you're not getting the weight gain, right? And then we've established at least some possible mechanisms and hypotheses that would match with these pattern results. And finally, just to point out that the usual disclaimer, the net effect of ENDS taxes on public health and economic welfare is a broad question with many aspects to it, and we highlight some of these interesting cross effects or lack thereof that matter for that puzzle, but it's a much bigger puzzle, right? So I'll stop there. Apologies, it looks like I'm 3 minutes over, but thank you for staying, and I'm happy to stay and take any more questions.
Right. So thank you very much. So there was an additional question, but maybe we can call it a day for those who want to leave. And the question is by Zunda Chisha, who asks I'm curious whether you consider potential peer effects in adolescent vaping or weight-related behaviors.
Definitely consider them in our minds. There's not a way I'm aware of here with these data. Correct me if I'm wrong, if someone knows, to get at that in a formal way. That's something that's probably worth a little discussion though in there. The peer effects, as I would see them here, would just sort of amplify whatever is happening. So let's suppose that, and I think that would be captured here in the reduced form, right? So the way I would think about peer effects here is that they would be sort of an argument for you doing this as a reduced form and not as an IV. It'd be like one more argument for that. And here's what I mean. Let's say you got this story where a kid who doesn't have the $10 in their pocket anymore doesn't go to the McDonald's, right, the one time. Well, this is a social sort of situation, a joint situation, and maybe they talk the rest of the group from going to McDonald's, right? Maybe they go do something, go play video games at somebody's house while mom brings them a plate of vegetables. I don't know if that's a thing, but something my mom would do. But or at least they're not like eating a bunch of junk food. So I could see that being like a multiplier, like an amplifier. Like the one teen who now is spending more on their vapes doesn't have the money to do whatever, and so their friends don't do it either, that kind of thing. So potentially you could have someone in that friend group who never vaped in their life, who just because their group isn't doing as much now, they might lose a couple of pounds. And with these kind of data, it's really hard. You would really need panel data to see if the effects are coming among ever vapors or not. that would actually be quite interesting. I can't do it with this data set. Yeah, so I don't know, I could go on, but I think it's a great thing to think about. That's like my first reaction. I think, is Anna have a question?
Yes, very interesting, Chuck. My question is a bit related to that one before. So can you check, do you have any data assessing how much these kids get together, for example? Because you could check whether they're less likely to get together, to go out in states in which you have higher taxes. And that would be interesting, because then you may see another unintended effect of these taxes on maybe like mental health or the likelihood of getting together. It may go through the income effect you explained, but still, I think it would be interesting to check that.
This potential multiplier effect is actually, I'm getting more interested in it just hearing the questions and thinking about them. Because if you think about, like, you know, you have, what was it, 6% of the sample, even for teens, is a habitual vapor. It's hard to think that a whole lot was going to happen with someone who vapes once a month, right? So it's if the entire effect is concentrated only among that 6% of the sample that was a habitual vapor anyway, that implies a very large impact among that 6%, right? Even if it's just 1 or 2 pounds. I mean, you just have to scale it up by 10, factor it over 10. And if it's possible that there are these spillover effects on people who never vaped, then that sort of makes it all the more plausible, right? Because kind of the share of the sample and effect could occur among it would go up. So I think that's actually a great thing to think about exploring. Not something I don't believe that can be done with these data. The question specifically on how much do kids get together is definitely not something in these data. I wonder if, I mean, does anyone know where a good data source that would have that? I'm sure it exists. Thinking like, because you have to have it with teens, right? It can't be adults. If anyone knows knows where that might be gettable, it'd be terrific. It'd be a good thing to look at. You know, a trick with a lot of these mechanisms and kind of preventing us from nailing it down a little more is you do have a treatment where the effect is kind of accruing among probably a somewhat small portion of the sample. So you're really kind of putting a strain on power. And you also have a state level treatment, right? So for all these reasons, you really need a very big sample. You need a lot of variation. And some of these data sets that are out there, especially the panel data sets, are just probably not going to be up to the task of getting precise enough estimates to be useful. But if anyone's aware of a large survey that's going to have answers to that question, I'd love to hear it. And feel free to email me too. But yeah, it's a great, maybe at a minimum, what we could do is, I mean, we could pull descriptive information on frequency of get-togethers and so on, just from other sources and just talk about it descriptively. But yeah, great question. I don't have a better answer at this time, but definitely worth thinking about more.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Chuck. It was a pleasure listening to you, and I think that we are very late, so we should.
Sorry.
Yes, but I don't know if there's anyone else having any other questions. Okay, well, thanks a lot.
All right, there's a few in the, okay.
Oh yeah, look, there's one by Catherine McLean. Yeah, I'm sorry if I missed this. I arrived a little late, but can you look at the weight management variables in the YRBS?
Yeah, all right, thanks, Catherine. Good idea. All right, thank you so much, everyone. Good to see all of you.
Thank you.
Nice.
Thanks, Chuck.
Everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.